Good morning, welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Obviously, we're in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. If you haven't yet, head over to We Are Sunderland and subscribe. It's just £1 for 6 months worth of content. And by doing so, you could be in with a chance of winning a Black Cats Bar season ticket, a pair of tickets in there for next season. So great prize. As per usual, it's myself, Matty, Hewitt, Joe Ramage, but we've got a special guest this morning, Sam, from the WD18 Watford podcast. How you doing, Joe? How you doing, Sam?
I'm very good, yeah.
I'm all good, thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Sam. So obviously we'll get sort of straight stuck into things. Watford season. I mean, looking at Watford from the outside, they're a funny old club, but you're obviously prime positioned, smack bang in the heart of things. How's the season sort of been, as a whole?
Yeah, it's been a really, really weird one, actually, because I think a lot of Watford fans going into this season, it was almost like going into the unknown in many ways, in terms of would we be going on a promotion push, or even in some cases, including myself, I was thinking, could we get sucked into a relegation battle here? I think that's the nature of the Championship. And I think the reality is it's been somewhere in between both of those. There's been periods this season where we've been looking up the table going, could we get a run of form together and potentially break into the top six? And there's also been periods more recently where we've looked over our shoulders going, could we get sucked into something here? And ultimately, neither of those are possible now. So nothing to play for other than pride, really. And Tom Cleverley's job as well, potential that he's going to be our manager here next season, and he's ultimately still here on trial, so to speak. So yeah, really interesting couple of games ahead to end the season for us.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into Tom Cleverley in a little bit, but just listening to that, Joe, it sounds very similar to sort of what we've been going through the past couple of weeks, doesn't it?
Yeah, remarkably. Sunderland at the start of the season, like Sam says, you would think the expectation would be to push on from last year, getting into the playoffs, or certainly be equivalent of that. And then, what's transpired, as we seem to talk about every week, the second half of the season's been so far off what happened last season and the beginning of this season. It's quite alarming. And, we've seen Watford themselves, last season, and obviously this season as well. It's almost becoming very similar circumstances for both clubs. And I guess it's a case of, if you don't get things right in terms of recruitment and, cycling through head coaches and things, that this is what can happen. You can sort of stagnate in the Championship.
If I just sort of take you back to the start of the season, Sam, obviously Valérien Ismail came in. He had quite a good record at Barnsley. It hasn't particularly gone well from wherever else he's ended up. But what was your sort of feeling going into the season? I know you said, just there that promotion wasn't too far. You thought that relegation could be, potential. How's he viewed it at Watford?
Yeah, he did an okay job, I think it's fair to say, with Val. Ironically, he didn't last the season, but he's still something like the top 3 longest serving managers we've had in the last few years. Very, very difficult hand he was dealt. Watford got rid of a lot of players last summer, the likes of Ismail Assar, Joao Pedro, obviously have gone on to bigger things now. And there was a huge, huge squad turnover. We know for the last few years, it's been a bit of a toxic environment at Watford as well. And I feel like that's something that he really was able to sort of remedy, because I think that even though things didn't go too well for him towards the end, I think it's a much better environment. And this Watford team are viewed a lot more favourably by supporters than in previous years, even though we are in mid-table. I think, interestingly, it was that the turning point for us this season, from a positive point of view, was losing 2-0 earlier in the season at the Stadium of Light, where it was rumoured after the game that Valérien Ismail kept the players in the dressing room after for about 2 hours. We were all sort of thinking he could lose his job here because we were on a really poor run of form. Next thing we know, a few days after, he signs a new contract. And after that, after holding the players to account, we went on a really, really good run of form, beating the likes of Preston 5-1. QPR away was a brilliant win as well. Blackburn away in the last minute. But things eventually, due to injuries, not recruiting well in January, things started to fall away eventually. And our owners, being our owners, decided to make that change. But look, I think, considering I thought there was a chance of being a relegation scrap, and he had us solid in mid-table, potentially looking up at promotion a couple of times, I thought we did a relatively okay job.
I mean, you mentioned it there, obviously the turnover in players at Watford. It certainly seems, again, from the outside looking in, that tends to be the case more seasons than not. I mean, obviously you mentioned Ismail Assar there, and obviously Joao Pedro. How have they sort of tried to fill, the void left by those two this season?
So effectively, the way that the Potsos, our owners, work is they've always got a conveyor belt of these young talents, pretty much, who, yeah, they work in. They bring through these young talents who we can develop and eventually sell on for a bigger fee. We saw that right at the start during the era with the likes of Richarlison. To a lesser extent, we brought in Gerard Deulofeu and sort of reignited his career with the likes of João Pedro. Now this season, we've got a player called Yasser Asprilla in there who's been really, really impressive for us. I'm not sure if you guys have seen too much of him, but he's been absolutely excellent. And without doubt, he's probably going to be off in the summer. So he's been helpful in filling that role, although I don't think he's at the same level that Pedro was at. But we've also got some really tidy players throughout the team as well, the likes of Ismail Kone, Georgie Chatfatadze, are all really, really good players. Young right back as well, Ryan Andrews, who's been a bit off form recently, but's had a really, really good season. I think what's better about this team than last year's team, I think we're more well-rounded this year. I know it's a cliche, but last year we heavily relied on João Pedro, very much a one-man team. But this year, while the quality perhaps isn't as good, I think we're definitely more well-rounded, and I think that's how we've combated it.
I'm interested just to ask you this before I move on to Joe. Do you see that as, the right sort of model that can get Watford back in the Premier League? Because it's not too dissimilar to what Sunderland's owners want to do. I think
it's difficult because back in the day, when we first got promoted, the first 2 times under the Potsos, it did work, to be fair. Sarr absolutely tore up the Championship a couple of years ago. That got us promoted. Even further back than that, we had the likes of Troy Deeney, Matty Vidra, Amin Abdi, who are absolutely unbelievable for us. I think now what's required with football is, because things are so sort of heavy tactically, you're required to be more well-rounded in the build-up, in the structure that we are in now. And I think it's better to have sort of, let's say, 8 or 9 players who are 7 out of 10 than just one player who's 10 out of 10, with the rest of the team being 6 out of 10, if that makes sense. So I think the structure is slowly evolving. There's lots of questions over the ownership in terms of whether they know what they're doing. They obviously also own Udinese, who good chance they'll get relegated this season out in Italy as well. So not the best year for the ownership, but I do think they are rethinking the model.
Do you think that it sort of had run its course with some of those players in terms of last season? I think, Watford came up to the Stadium United at a similar sort of time, 2-2 draw, similar positions as well. And I seem to recall there was quite a little bit of animosity towards some of that squad. Had it run its course? Did some of them need to be moved on?
I think so. I don't think the team is overall, in terms of the starting team, is too dissimilar to what we saw. I think what was, and this is where I credit Valon Behrami, I think the players down tools so easily last season. At any moment where it looked like a team would be a bit aggressive with us or a bit physical with us, they just give up. And that's what made it so difficult to almost like the team last season. I think that's, where credit has to go to Valon Behrami. I think that's sort of been eradicated now. I think there's a lot more discipline in the team. I think we're all working in the same direction a lot more now. And it's a young team that's learning, which I think makes a huge, huge difference. We obviously made big money in the summer off selling the likes of Pedro and Sarr. We also saw over the last year, 18 months, the likes of William Troost-Ekong move on, who was a big player in the dressing room, but ultimately a dressing room that was failing. He moved on, and a whole load of other players as well. So I don't know why I just singled out William Troost-Ekong there, but so many players have gone that it's difficult to almost remember them because it's a new squad every year.
Yeah. You talk about the sort of the reinvesting into the squad again, like what Matty touched on. Sunderland are probably going to have to do that this summer. Jack Clark is the one that keeps being mentioned in terms of being the big money sale. From an outside point of view, is that something you think the Sunderland will have to do this summer compared to what you saw last season against them this time of the year and what's happened this year?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of selling players, do you think? Yeah, I think so. Particularly because such a huge club like yourselves, if you're going to kick on, you ultimately need to invest in the Championship. And Sunderland have, I don't know if underachieve is the right word, because I think what happened last season was more of an overachievement. And I think probably where your squad is at the moment is roughly where you should be, looking in from the outside. Obviously, as a club, you should be in the Premier League. But in terms of the squad itself, you are probably a mid-table team. So I think in order to invest, I think it might be worth just taking that hit, missing out on that big player to become a bit more well-rounded all round.
I think it's certainly a fair comment and a fair assessment. I think that's what we've spoken about at length, obviously on the podcasts that we do. It's just on Sunderland's recruitment. This year they've invested a lot into young players in the hope that they'll turn them around. They'll sort of unearth hidden gems. They've sort of strayed away from that, as me and Joe have spoken about. They've brought in players, younger players from abroad. Now, as you've said there with Watford, it can work. And it's something that, it's been prevalent theme, hasn't it, at the Hornets? I mean, it hasn't quite worked out here yet. Sunderland's actually had a lot more success from getting youngsters from the likes of West Ham's academy. You've got Pierre Ekwa, Agialis, Dennis Sirkin obviously came through Spurs. I think what's interesting as well, you talk about the championship investment. It's finding that balance, isn't it, of bringing in seasoned, experienced players as well, because that's where Sunderland sort of find themselves. I'm keen to pick your brains on the situation and the squad balance at Watford. How have Watford over the past couple of years balanced that out with bringing those youngsters in?
I actually think this year has been probably the best balance it's been in terms of having those experienced players and those young players. I think in previous years we've had teams that have been way too young. We've had teams that have been way too old and disinterested coming to the end of their career. I look back to our relegation 2 or 3 years ago now, and that was just a squad of like 30 players who were all just completely disinterested in what was going on. This year, I feel like we recruited really, really smartly. We brought in Jake Livermore, who a lot of fans was almost thinking, do you know what, his legs are gone. And albeit he hasn't played as much in the second half of the season, but when we were going through that really positive run of form, he was a huge, huge player for us. And I think what he offers the dressing room from speaking to people is absolutely, it's so valuable to Watford. We also had the likes of Ben Hamer, who was starting during periods of this season. We've got experience throughout the whole team. Dan Backman's experience, Ryan Porteous, Wesley Hoot, Francisco Sierra Alta as well, to sort of complement the young players coming through, like Espria, Ryan Andrews, James Morris. I think it's a really, really nice blend. And I think that's why, like I say, while Watford fans aren't happy at all about finishing the season in mid-table, lower half, I do think this team is quite likeable.
Yeah, that's something I was going to ask you about there is how's the season been viewed as a whole? Because as you say there, relegation from the Premier League 3 years ago, Watford would still be viewed as one of the sides, at least anyway, if you look on paper, as one of the sides that you would think could sneak in or should be competing at the top end. I know obviously the parachute payments, etc., has come to an end, but they're still one of the sides that have yo-yoed between the Championship and the Premier League.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been a surreal sort of 10, 12 years being a Watford fan. Probably some of the best times we've had. Of course, in 2019, we achieved our best ever Premier League finish and reached the FA Cup final. Yeah. But ever since then, it's completely fallen apart. The year after that, we got relegated in the COVID season. Then we got promoted straight away again behind closed doors, relegated with one of our worst seasons ever. And then it's just been the last 2 years in the Championship, with last year being particularly poor. So I think we needed a reset this season, and Watford fans accepted that. I think it's easy as a football fan to sort of be reactionary in the moment and look at things. So, for example, we had a real opportunity in December to really kick on, and we were thinking in January, bring in 3, 4, 5 players, and we could really push for the playoffs here. Brought in Emmanuel Dennis, for example, who we thought this could be a really, really big signing for us. He wasn't fit ultimately and hasn't really impressed to the extent that he probably should have done. But with the whole January investment wasn't good enough. And that was frustrating because I feel like we missed a really good opportunity to kick on. But if I'm taking a step back and looking at it from the start of the season, like I said, it's a mixed bag in terms of young players and experienced players. And I thought there was a good chance that we could get sucked into a relegation battle, which might seem unlikely, but it's not impossible in the Championship. We look at big teams down there now this season, such as Blackburn, who in previous years have pushed for a promotion spot. So I think taking a step back, I think, as I said with Sunderland, I think if you look objectively at this Watford squad, it's a mid-table team ultimately, and that's where we are.
How much do you think what's gone on at Watford over the last couple of years has been down to the continued sort of cycle of going through managers? We'll come on to Tom Cleverley just again because Sunderland, quite synonymous in their Premier League times of getting to sort of October, November, changing manager and then having to survive down the stretch. And, this model as well seems as though it's going to be quite flexible in terms of bringing in a new head coach, but trying to keep the rest of the structure of the club the same as and when they see fit.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is where the model has to change. And I think it slowly is changing. They gave Valerian Ismail an extra bit of time. I do think it did have a big impact because originally, when it was working for us 10 years ago, people forget in 2014-15, we got promoted with 4 managers that season, which is
incredible,
unheard
really.
of. Yeah, 4 managers. And what worked really well that year was the team would react off new manager bounces. So to speak, it was just a season of new manager bounces. And as soon as that manager bounce finished, they sacked the manager, bring in another one and get another bounce in. And to be fair, that kept us in the Premier League for 5 or 6 years as well and got us to an FA Cup final. But then eventually, I think what happened is when the team got worse, and I think when we went away from what was working so well for us, it seeped its way into the mentality of the players being like, oh, we don't have to take responsibility here. Let's just get rid of the manager. I think we've seen that so many times. I even think less so Valon Ismail, but last season with the likes of Slaven Bilic, even Rob Edwards, when the players don't like them, they just sort of give up because they know that the ownership will make a change and they don't have to take responsibility. So while we have made a managerial change this season, I do think that it does mark some sign of improvement. It's only been 2 managers this season. I can't believe I'm saying that. It's just modern day football. It's progress that we only sacked 1 manager this year, but it's the reality of Watford.
Yeah, just before Matty comes back in there as well, on the head coaches, you've seen any sort of head coach, foreign, this home base, what has tended to work for you? And I mean, Chris Wilder was in recently, you mentioned Rob Edwards there, brief spell, Tom Cleverley there now, but you've certainly been on the other end of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, it's a really, really difficult one. I really liked Rob Edwards. Obviously, he's now gone to our biggest rivals, got them promoted and got them in with a fighting chance of staying in the Premier League, which hurts. And that's why a lot of Watford fans have turned on the ownership as well. I think our most successful times have come under Javi Gracia, the FA Cup final year. Slavisa Kanovic got us promoted in 2015, even Cisco Munoz. And I think what those managers would do really well, particularly Cisco and Javi, where they were really good man managers, really good motivators, really good at putting their arms over the shoulders of players. And while the squads are really, really different to that now, I think the theme is still there, that the Watford players do need just a manager to put their arm over the shoulder of particularly young players. And I think that's when we thrive.
Just, I'm keen again, obviously, we're speaking about Valerian Ismail. Where did it go wrong for him? Because, as you've said there, he's quite well respected still, but obviously behind the scenes. But where did it go wrong?
I think the January window, supposedly, according, I think it was to the Watford Observer, he was offered the chance to sign. He basically gave his list of players that he wanted. When the club said, we can't give you these players, but we can give you our list of players, he basically said no. So we were then left with a really thin squad with a few injuries that really made us struggle there. I think it was a bit stubborn with the way that we played in terms of that 4-3-3 formation as well.
Yeah.
We weren't scoring enough goals. Melissa Rivic, Vagun Bio haven't set the world alight this season. I just think things went really stale really, really quickly. And credit to the players, because I think in previous seasons they would have down tools a lot quicker than they would have done this season. But I think it got to the point where it was untenable and everyone could see that the performances were going and the results were going. And at that point, like I say, we're looking over our shoulders going, we're only 6 points off the relegation zone. And with the likes of Sheffield Wednesday picking up points, for example, QPR under Cifuentes, we really did have to make a change at that point.
I mean, what sort of impact has Tom Cleverley had? I know we spoke, obviously, off recording a couple of days ago just on Tom Cleverley's impact. What's he made? Because he's still an interim charge, isn't he?
Yeah, of course. So it's like a prolonged job interview, this, for him. On paper, it might look like it's 1 win in 7, which a lot of people might be like, do you know what, that's not great. But context has to be applied there. We played Leeds, we played Southampton, we played Ipswich. We took points at Portman Road. We took points off Leeds as well, which was 2 excellent performances. Southampton, we were robbed and probably should have drawn that game as well, handballed in the last minute. Probably the only disappointing performance so far was Preston when we drew 0-0 at home, and we probably should have done a bit more to be a bit more creative. But he's a young manager and he's learning. Other than that, I think all 6 out of 7 performances have been really, really positive. really, really good. I think, like I said, in terms of putting his arm around players, he obviously played with a lot of these players as well. I think he's been really, really good at that. And we're seeing the best of the likes of Tom Bashira in the middle of the park. Edo Kayembe's been excellent. Ryan Porteous as well. So I think that's what he's done really well. And I think in terms of style of play, he's taken Watford back to basics. And that's what's been really impressive.
I mean, you mentioned the 4-3-3. Is that something that he's sort of moved away from? I know that you mentioned again, obviously I'll let Joe come in a little bit about obviously the lack of goals, again, the similarities there between the two clubs, but how's Tom Cleverley approached things? I know you say he's gone back to basics. Are they still sort of in a 4-3-3?
So it's now a 3 at the back. We play 3 at the back with it's almost a 3-5-2 pretty much, but it's almost quite fluid when we have the ball as well in terms of centre backs moving forward. Porteous scored the other week against Southampton, for example, having made that run forward as well. So it's been refreshing to have that change. I just think the 4-3-3 went a bit stale under Valérien Ismaël. And I think the players are suited to 5 at the back a lot more, because particularly our centre backs, they're not the best centre backs in the world. I do like them, but likes of Matty Pollock, Ciaralta, Hewitt, Porteous, they need the support of each other. And I think having that extra cushion with the 5 at the back has really helped them.
Yeah, Sunderland have done exactly the same in terms of shifting to a back 5 in recent weeks. And just looking through the both sets of results, both teams have drawn a blank in 3 of the last 4 games without risk of getting people to turn off from this. How does that change? How do we get a thriller on Saturday?
Unlikely, to be honest with you. I think what under Tom Cleverley, very much the foundation has been, let's keep it solid and try and nick one on the break or when we do have opportunities. The problem with Watford is we're not clinical at all. When we do have chances, we don't take them. Well, we should have beaten Hull the other day. Mateus Martins had an unbelievable opportunity towards the end where he should have scored it. But I think the only game where we've sort of gone away from being so pragmatic was ironically the Leeds game, where I think we saw an opportunity to attack them. We did, and we nearly got something out of that game. But even the one game that he did win was Birmingham away on his first game, and we went 1-0 up through quite a fortunate goal. But other than that, it was just soaking up the pressure, which I think we did really, really well. So if I'm being honest, I don't think we're in for a thriller at the weekend.
Is it a case of being pragmatic, or is it a blend of perhaps a lack of quality in the final third as well? Because that's certainly been the issue here.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, because I think if we had sort of ruthless strikers, I don't think we'd be calling it pragmatic, because we'd have won games 2-3-0 genuinely. So any team that wins 2 or 3-0, I don't think you're necessarily going to call them pragmatic. I think it would become more sort of a counter-attacking team. But ultimately, we're not reliable on our strikers. And if you can't win games, at least don't lose them. And I think that's where Watford are at the moment.
You mentioned
we've drawn something like 16 games this season or something ridiculous like that. So,
I mean, even if you turn a handful of them into wins, it changes the complexion of the table, doesn't it?
100%.
You mentioned Asprilla there. I think 6 goals, 6 assists. Is he the key man?
Yeah, definitely. He's sometimes a bit in and out of form. I feel like as a young player, particularly towards the end of the season, I think he has struggled at times of the season, particularly physicality wise. But when he gets the ball, when he's on it, he's just unbelievable. If you haven't seen it, check out his goal from Norwich away earlier in the season. It was an absolute rocket. But yeah, I think he's definitely the one to watch for Watford. I'd also say Tom Bashira, if he's back in the middle of the park, I think he's going to be a really, really important player for us, particularly with progressing the ball in terms of going from pragmatic to a counter-attacking team. He's probably the most important player in that for us.
You mentioned the good goal there in the reverse fixture. Obviously, Niall Huggins scored an excellent goal for Sunderland. What did you make of Sunderland in that reverse fixture?
Yeah, I thought you guys were good. You still had Tony Mowbray at that point as well, and I'm a big fan of him. Obviously, sending him best wishes as well at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was it was at that point, obviously, you guys lost Amad Diallo in the summer, and he was a huge player for you. But at the same time, you're thinking, how does Sunderland kick on and sort of force a promotion push this season? And ultimately, from an outside perspective, it hasn't at all. And I think one thing that you see with Sunderland fans, because the expectation is so high, because you're a huge football club, I think sometimes that weight of expectation, sometimes the players might struggle with that. It looks like a young team as well from the outside. I do really like some of your players, but yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame that it hasn't materialised. A relatively okay start to the season. into what could have been a good season for you guys.
Did the Mowbray decision surprise you from the outside? I mean, Sunderland only 3 points off the playoffs at that point.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the two, I think, most shocking decisions this season was the Tony Mowbray one, because also the fact you brought in Mick Beale straight after, and I've never been the biggest Mick Beale fan. I mean, it's sort of it's not the same, but it's sort of akin to John Eustace leaving Birmingham at the start of the season, because both clubs, obviously Birmingham's has been a lot steeper and a lot worse, have gone on similar trajectories after that. So I was really, really surprised by that decision as well. Dodds has done an okay job, it seems, since coming back in. Obviously, he got that win away at West Brom the other week. But I think a club of Sunderland's size, I think, should be ambitious in the summer, or as ambitious as they can be, in trying to attract a big name to come in and hope and take you guys up next season.
Yeah, that's great, Sam. We'll draw things to a close there. Thanks very much for joining us. Again, a quick push for We Are Sunderland again. We're sponsored by the Fan Museum and Cospex Opticians. If you head over to We Are Sunderland, you can subscribe for just £1 for 6 months worth of coverage, and you could be in with a chance of winning Black Cats Bar season tickets. Once again, Sam, thanks for joining us.
Cheers, mate.